Yo, what up guys, how's it going? Kermode here. In this video, I'm actually going to give you guys a super quick crash course on Serum. I drank a lot of coffee today, and so I want to get through Serum as quickly as possible and give you guys like a 20-minute, 30-minute guide to Serum that you guys could actually pretty much learn this thing inside and out really quickly. This is not going to be a full course on making the wavetables, and this is not going to be a super detailed course on making the sounds. This is more looking at pretty much every single parameter and understanding what it's doing, or at least all the important ones for a beginner. So if you're a beginner and you've never seen Serum before, this is a great video. You're gonna have to pause and take a lot of notes, but you should get a lot out of this, so we should probably get going. Let's do it. So let me kick things off with an introduction. For those that don't even really know what Serum is, it's a wavetable synthesizer. A wavetable synthesizer is a synthesizer where its sound comes from what's known as wavetables. These wavetables are single cycles all lined up side by side that you can scroll through to pick cool tones and timbres. Now, what's a single cycle? Well, if you think of a sine wave as being a single cycle, one movement, in that one cycle, your speaker went forward and back in a sine wave motion, and then it would repeat that at the speed of your pitch. So for example, an A, I forget which A, is 440 hertz, which means that sine wave would move your speakers in that sine wave pattern 440 times per second. So a cycle is a shape, which you can see here in this wavetable. We've got a saw. That means this cycle, this saw cycle, our speakers are moving in that direction at the rate of which the note we pick. And a wavetable lets you pick from really complex ones and scroll through smoothly to get these really unique tones and timbres. What also makes Serum so much more of a standout wavetable synth is you can build your own wavetables as well, which will be a whole course unto itself. So now that you guys got a bit of an intro, let's actually look at the oscillators themselves. So here you have oscillator A and oscillator B. Now each one can generate their own tone. Now the first thing you can do is select the type of wavetable from your drop-down menu. If you select one, you then can head down to this wavetable position knob, which will scroll through that sound and change the character of it. You can see that represented there, and if you click the wavetable, you get a nice 3D view as well. So that's how you pick a wavetable, and that's how you pick its position. You can also scroll through them here with these arrows. Now below that, you have the actual pitch, first in octaves, then in semitones, then in cents. Now this here is a coarse pitch which goes between semitones and cents, and the reason for this is if you're modulating, you're changing the pitch over time, it doesn't sound so chunky and steppy. It's kind of a smooth way of moving through the pitch. Now this pencil button here is going to open up the wavetable editor, which again is a whole course unto itself. I wouldn't worry about that if you're just starting out in Serum right now. Now these three parameters here are going to determine the unison and the values of the unison. Now unison is when you stack multiple versions of the same sound to kind of thicken it up. So the unison amount here is you pick how many. So right now I have 16 versions of the same sound layered on top of itself. Then you can choose to detune it here, and this is going to spread their pitch apart, which makes them kind of spread apart and thicken up the sound. If you hear they're all not detuned at all here, kind of just sounds like the same sound. But as they detune, you can hear it spread apart. And then there's a blend, which is kind of the volume of those unisons. Over here you have a phase knob, which is going to allow you to scroll through the cycle and choose where you're starting in that cycle, which can actually determine some small characteristics of the sound. So it is important to actually know that. And then you have a random button, which is going to decide each time you trigger the sound if it's even going to start randomly elsewhere in the phase, or you could have it actually start where you want it. So where I actually selected this position, which means it's going to sound exactly the same every time I trigger it, versus random, it's hard to tell, but it's starting somewhere else in its cycle every time. Wavetable position we've already covered. This is going to allow you to scroll through the different cycles. Get some really cool sounds there. And now here is one of my favorite knobs in the oscillator section. These are the warp options. And what these do is they take your cycle and they further bend it and change it and warp it. Each one has such a unique characteristic. I really recommend going in and playing with each of them and getting to know them. And my favorite are these remap ones where you can hit the pencil tool. See, as I move it, nothing happened, but as I hit the pencil tool, I can draw my own shape and it'll bend and warp that cycle depending on what shape I draw here, which is just further customizing options inside of Serum. So cool. Now, oscillator B is similar to oscillator A. Now, what's cool is when you have them both going, you also have the option to FM, AM, and RM from the other oscillator. So if I pick a really basic shape here, even with the volume down on this one, as I increase this, this one's going to frequency modulate this one. You can get some really cool tones out of that. And then to the right, you have panning, which will obviously pan the sound, and the volume of the sound. So that's the basics of the oscillator section inside of Serum. Let's check out the sub oscillator and the noise oscillator. So now I want to take a look at the noise oscillators and the sub oscillator. The sub oscillator here is an independent oscillator separate from the other two, which can only be changed pitch in terms of octaves, and it has this really cool direct out button which allows it to avoid the filtering and avoid the effects. Essentially, it allows you to layer a sub under everything else. You have very specific waveforms you can pick from: sine, kind of a squarier sine, more triangle-y sine, triangle, saw, square, and then kind of a pulse with the square, an uneven square. Below you have the octave itself. Can go up in high octaves, so you could also use this thing technically as a lead and stuff as well. Panning, and the level. Now below that is the noise oscillator. The noise oscillator is really cool because it's a sampler built into this thing. So by default you have, the regular noises, white noise as you would expect, which you can control by pitch, pan, and volume. And then you have the same phase position and random position. Now, what's really cool, this phase position, is it's actually a start point for the entire sample. So I'm actually going to grab a bass sample here. And if I drag it in here, you'll see that it actually came in. And it actually can be played here. Now this phase is going to change the start point. You'll hear too, if I move it while the sound's playing, you get a cool record scratching style effect. Pretty cool. Now what's really important though is I want to actually play this across my keyboard. So you have to press this key scale here, and now this thing will actually track across my keyboard. Very useful. You also have this one-shot mode which prevents it from looping. By default, if I play the sample, you'll hear it'll just loop over and over. But if I want something to be a one-shot, turn that on and it only plays one time. So both these additional sound sources are going to be really useful. Let's check out the filter section. So the filter section here is going to be what allows you to sculpt and filter the sound further. You've got a power button up here, which if I didn't mention for all the other ones is the power button to turn them all on. And here you have a drop down menu to pick the different filter types. Now you have the basic ones, you have lows, highs, bands, peaks, and notches with different pole and peak values. If you don't know what that is, it's how steep it is. So a 6 dB filter is going to be a lot less steep than a 24 dB one. And a less steep one is going to be less obvious. Now this multi one is multiple filters in one. For example, this HN is a high pass and a notch. You have a high pass cutoff as well as a notch cutoff. So this allows you to get more complex filtering with more than one filter type in one. Now the flanges are really cool. These are like combs and phasers and flangers, and you get some really unique tones and timbres out of this. Love the potential with all of those ones. Now these miscellaneous ones are different types of filters. You essentially have EQ types, ring mod, which is going to get weird, crazy results, and some of my favorite, such as the reverb, sounds phenomenal, and the cool formant filters. So your homework is to play around and experiment with the different filter types and get used to them. Let's go back to a low pass here so we can go through the different settings. So you have the cutoff, which is actually going to change where the filter's engaging, where the filter's actually filtering. You have the resonance, which is going to create a volume peak where the cutoff is, making that filtering more obvious, or without it, less obvious. You have a panning offset, which is going to actually filter each ear a little differently and create a nice stereo effect. You have a drive, which is actually going to drive this thing and add some extra gain and beef into the sound. As well as a fatness knob here. Now this fatness knob and some of these parameters are going to change depending on the filter type you're using. So if we go to something like low pass, band pass, high pass 24 here, you have a cutoff, but now you have a morph knob, which actually morphs between those three. So just be prepared that that knob might change. And then you have a mix, which will actually dial back the amount of filtering. Also, if you click this mix knob, it becomes a level knob and it actually turns into essentially volume. It's actually a cool function there. And if you click the filter, you can actually see how it's affecting the phase of your sound, something a little nerdier, a little dorkier, not very necessary if you're kind of just starting out. Now, to determine the routing, what's actually going into the filter, you actually turn those on and off here. So with A on, only oscillator A is going to go to the filter. B will pass right through, but if I turn B on here, they're both in that filter together. Same thing here, you turn on the noise, you turn on the sub. Now what's really important is this key tracking button here. And it's just like the key tracking you saw in the noise. And what it does is it'll move the cutoff across your keyboard. It'll actually move that cutoff and correlate to the notes on your keyboard. And the reason this is important is if we're using something like the comb filter. The comb filter has really crazy resonances, and it might sound good when you play a specific note. That sounds great when I play an E, but when I move up to an F, or even more so a G, it doesn't quite sound the same. But if you hit this key tracking, if you achieve a timbre like this one, when I go across my keyboard, that timbre and that filter cutoff will actually move and correlate. So that is a really important button, and that is the fundamentals of our filter section. So now I want to move on to the modulation inside of Serum. Modulation is how you get parameters to move over time or become playable and expressive. So you have a huge set of modulators at the bottom here. You have 3 potential envelopes, which I'll explain in a second, and 8 potential LFOs. I'll show you the hidden ones in a bit, as well as some macros and velocity and note modulation. All of which really useful, really important. So for the sake of this demonstration, I'm only going to modulate the volume of this sound to make things more obvious. So let me first tell you about the envelopes. To modulate something with an envelope, or anything, you need to actually click and drag this little plus onto the modulation source. Then you need to click and drag to set the mod depth. And the mod depth is how far that modulator is actually going to move that parameter over time. Now that we've done that, this envelope will affect this volume over time. Now, how an envelope works is it's got an ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, release. And the attack is how long it takes for that sound to fully engage in that modulation distance, mod depth. The sustain is where it's going to go when you hold a note. The decay is how long it takes to get to that sustain value. And the release is what happens when you release a note. Where does it go? Confusing if you're just learning about it. Just watch this over and over and it'll start to make sense. So the attack is how long it's going to take to reach the end of this mod depth. So if we've got a 1.27 second attack, takes that long to get there. The decay and sustain is how long is it going to take to reach this point when I hold down a note. So 1 second, so now it's going to take 1.27 seconds to reach its full mod depth. Then it's going to take another 1 second to drop down to 47% of that down here. And if you didn't see that, there's actually a little dot represented that'll show that off. Check that out, really useful. Now the release is when I release my keyboard. How long does it take to reach the bottom of its mod depth? So right now I've got a really long one. And you see it took quite a while to fade out. Now by default, envelope 1 here is actually the master envelope. It's the volume for everything. And these don't have to just be applied to volume. This can be used to modulate any parameter over time. So if I just pick something here, really useful. And you have 3 of those. The next type of modulator is an LFO, a low frequency oscillator, and what that does is it slowly modulates a parameter over and over based off the shape you give it. It's going to continuously move it in that shape. So if we have a very basic one here and I just toss it on the volume, click and drag to set the mod depth, the volume goes up and down in that shape. Now you can double click to add dots, which is really cool, and create your own shapes. Which is really handy. Hold shift and you get sort of a step pattern. And you can highlight multiple ones at once and actually move them around as well. Or if you hold shift, they start to invert and have some really weird behaviors. If you grab a bunch, hold command, click and drag, you see you get this rainbow pattern, and what this does is when you move it, it will exponentially squish into each other and get these really unique shapes. I'm sure those all went over your head really quick. Again, go back and watch this video later. It's packed with a ton of gold nuggets. So now that I have a shape I want and I'm modulating the parameter I want, the next thing I want to do is pick the rate. Straightforward, synchronized rate to your song. If you hit the BPM button, it's actually going to be unsynchronized. Good to know. Below that you have an anchor button, and what the anchor button will do is it will actually synchronize the change of rate to your tempo. And the reason for this is if it wasn't synchronized and you changed it, things would kind of fall out of time, but it would sound smoother. Let's press play and actually see what that sounds like. I'll turn it off. So without the anchor, it smoothly changed those rates. It didn't jump at all, but it fell out of time because it's smoothly moved. It's important. It's a good parameter to know. You've got this triplet function here, which is going to allow you to put things into triplet grid, really useful, or a dotted grid here as well. Now you have a rise, which is actually essentially an attack to the LFO automation. So if I give it a bar, it's going to take a bar to reach this full automation value. Took a bar to get there, really cool. And you have a delay, which will actually just delay this even happening, a bar. So it's going to take a bar to even start. And then after a bar, it started. Now you have this smooth knob, which will smooth things out really good if you have the steps we were talking about earlier. Now you have 3 different modes here. Off is just a regular LFO mode. It just is always playing. Trigger means it restarts its sequence every time I play it. While off, it could have been anywhere in its sequence. And envelope means it's going to play its sequence once and stop, essentially becoming more envelopes. Now you have a grid here which you can change, which is important for when you're drawing. You can actually change how simple that grid is. Pretty useful. And you can pick your presets here from this drop-down menu. Now if at any point you make a shape you want and you want to alter it, hold Alt, click and drag, and it actually copies it over to the next one. Hold Alt, click and drag, copies that over to the next one. One more time, copies over to the next one. Now if you use number 4, you'll notice 5 appears. If you use 5, number 6 appears. Use 6, number 7 appears. Use 8, That's all you got. You got 8. That's probably more than you'll ever need. So you actually have 8 potential LFOs here. Super useful. And again, you can start to make these into really complex shapes. Double click to add a dot, click a dot in between to add curves. It gets out of control. The automation in Serum is so underrated. It's so good. Awesome. So now our other modulation type is a macro. And a macro is a stagnant, non-moving modulation source that all it does is it moves when you move this macro, but it moves everything it's mapped to at once. So this is really useful for making really complex sounding growls, basses, whatever, anything. But they only move when you turn that knob. So it kind of gives you just like maximum control. Really useful. Now you have a velocity modulation here, which will actually modulate this parameter based off the velocity input in your actual MIDI clip. Super useful. And you can note scale things, which is just like the key tracking button we looked at, the filter and everything, where that parameter will scale across your keyboard. So, you know, super useful. So the modulation in this is insane. There are more options, but we'll be going into that later when we go into the Matrix tab. But those are the ones, the surface ones you see right now. At any point too, you can right click to pick a mod source, and you can add a mod source. You can right click to remove a mod source. You can right click to bypass it as well. Bypassing it is like removing it without fully removing it. You can see it's grayed out and you can re-engage it at any time. Just allows you to test things out. So yeah, a lot going on with the modulation, but that's what allows Serum to be so complex and have so much movement and be so crazy. I know it's a lot, but we got a lot more, so let's keep going. So now that we have our basic sound, we want to make it a lot cooler. Let's head on over to the effects section up here. So the effects are really cool, where you turn them on with the power button, and then by simply clicking and dragging them, you can restructure their order. And how that's going to work is one effect is going to go into the next one, going to go into the next one, going to go into the next one. So I just messed up the default order, but I'm sure it's fine. At the top, you normally have this hyper dimension. And what this is it's a hyper expander as well as a dimension expander. Essentially, the hyper expander is more unisons, where you have the amount of unisons, a mix, how detuned they are, and then a modulation rate, which is how fast they're kind of detuning and modulating. You have this re-trigger button, and what this does is the unison detune will re-trigger from its starting point every time you press a note. You can hear them kind of spread apart like that. It's pretty cool. Versus starting detuned. Then you have a dimension expander, which is kind of like the one out of Massive, where you have a mix knob and then simply a size knob. Super easy. So just 2 ways to add some width into your sound. Next we have the distortion unit. I love the distortion unit in this thing. You have a mix over here and a drive, how hard this thing is hitting the distortion. And then you have the distortion types. Now when you hit the X shaper, what this is you actually have the ability to create your own distortion wave shaper shapes, and then the drive actually fades between the 2 shapes. So let's create one over here. And then on side A, we'll create a whole different one. And then that fades between their 2 shapes. Pretty cool. And then A shaper asymmetrical will do an asymmetrical version of that, which yields different results as well. Now what's really cool too is you have a filter built in. So right now it's on off, and you have a pre and post for the filter. Is this filter happening pre-distortion, which is going to get way more extreme results, or post, which will give you less harmonics because the filter is then filtering out the distorted harmonics. You have a flanger, which is pretty straightforward. You have the rate at which it's modulating, a depth for the amount, feedback, which will increase how obvious it is, and a phase, which will offset it in the stereo field and make it kind of wide. Now what's pretty cool about this is you can turn the rate down to 0, and you can do this for the phaser, and I believe the chorus as well, we'll find out in a minute, where it's no longer modulating and you have full control over that. Dry wet over here and power right there. So now we have the phaser, very similar. Rate down to 0. You have a depth. You can select a frequency, feedback, and phase, and again you get full control over that. You can also synchronize this to BPM. I don't know if I showed that off in flanger. Yeah, you can synchronize it to the BPM there, so the rate becomes synchronized. You have a chorus, and the rate can turn down to 0. Cool. It can also be synchronized, and how the chorus works is it's creating multiple voices, detuning them, kind of like unison's a little different. You've got a low pass built in here. You have the depth of the pitch detuning, the rate, feedback, which is where this thing starts to get different than the unison. You can get some really cool results. And then the delay time between the two ears. And when the rate's off and the feedback's up, you get these really cool metallic tones. Super creative, I like it. You have a delay, just kind of your typical delay. You can pick between normal, ping pong style, and tape delay. You have the feedback, how long that delay is going to feed back into itself and keep on delaying. A built-in filter for the delay. The rate over here, and you can synchronize it to BPM. You can link the two ears so they're always the same timing. Or you can unlink them and get different rates. Obviously you can turn off the BPM and it's no longer synced and it's just time. And then down here you can offset them, which allows you to swing, or if you move it far enough you get into triplet grid or dotted grid, so it allows you to create more unique timings there. Awesome. So now we have the compressor. The compressor has a nice dry wet here. Threshold for where the compressor is actually engaging. And you can see how much it's compressing there. The ratio of compression, higher ratio, more compression. When you reach all the way to the right, you actually get a limiter, pretty cool. You have an attack, how long it takes for the compression to actually engage after you've crossed the threshold. A release, how long after you've gone back under the threshold does it take to stop compressing. And you have some post gain. Just allows you to compensate. Where this gets really cool is this multiband button here. Allows you to turn this thing into an OTT compressor, which is based off a really cool preset of the multiband compressor in Ableton. And you just get some really nice results. Now on a sound like this, it's not going to be quite as obvious, but when you have some other sounds with very little harmonics, this 3-band top-down compressor is adding extreme gain to the 3 bands and extreme compression, which just brings up frequencies you wouldn't normally hear and can just turn sounds that are quite dull into quite exciting. This is a really bad example because there's nothing going on here, but I really recommend experimenting with this. It's easy to go overboard, but you could also dial back the bands here. You can kind of play with them. You can even modulate them, by the way, for those that didn't know that. Drop an LFO on there and actually modulate the bands. Really cool. Love the compressor. Now the reverb, you have a dry wet here, and on the left you have 2 different types. You have a plate reverb and a hall reverb. 2 very different characteristics. You have the size of the room when you're working with the hall here. How big the reverb feels. You see if you modulate that, you get cool pitch stuff. The decay, how long is it gonna decay out? You can low cut it, so you can cut out some of the lows, cut out some of the highs. You have a spin function and a spin depth, which it kind of adds modulation and movement into the reverb. And that's our reverb there. Now you have a built-in EQ. The EQ is also quite simple. You have on the left a low shelf or a low cut, and on the right you have a high shelf or a high cut. Each of them have independent bells where you can pick a frequency, pick the gain, and pick the Q. The Q will affect the steepness of the shelves and the resonance on the cuts. And it's quite simple. You just move it around. It's an additional EQ built into this thing, allows you to further sculpt your sound. And I recommend even modulating these to get cool sweeps through your sound. Kind of an all-pass effect. And then you have an additional filter, which is just like the filter we dealt with before. Same filters in the drop-down menu, same settings. It's just in the effects section. So you have a whole other filter in here. I know, it's a lot to take in. It's dope. This synth is awesome. I know I'm racing through it. This is a crash course. I'm giving you guys the quick rundown on this thing. Now let's look at the Modulation Matrix. So I just opened up any old patch here. Some nice effects, some nice movement. And this matrix here is where you're gonna see all this routing. See how this has 20 on it? It's all this routing in one nice drop-down menu. So how it works is you see the source, so you can see that, you know, LFO2 I mapped to the volume of oscillator A. You can see the mod depth, as well as the movement in there. Now what's cool and different about this, and I'll create a new patch here, are some of the settings we haven't looked at yet. So I'm gonna map LFO1 here to oscillator A's volume. Straightforward. The more I increase that amount, you can see the more I increase that. Now it started from the position of the knob, so I'm actually gonna move it back so we got the full range here. Or something we can look at is we can make this bi-directional. So right now the LFO is just moving this parameter in one direction. But if we click this type here, you'll see it's actually going two directions now. It's going back and forth past the cutoff point or the point of where it started modulating. You can also click Shift and Alt to change that. So it's just kind of a quick key command there. Now the other important things in here is the auxiliary source, where you can set a different source to actually choose how much that modulation is even occurring. So for example, if I set macro 1 to be the auxiliary source here, it's not modulating right now till I turn up macro 1. So now you can have modulators affecting modulators and things get really crazy. Now what else is cool is in here, you have things that you can modulate that you couldn't originally modulate. So let's say we took LFO1 here. I can also modulate this to some other parameters we didn't look at. For example, in the global section, you have the master tune. This is where you're going to add vibrato to sounds. Because now this is modulating the pitch of the sound. Couldn't actually achieve that anywhere else otherwise. And again, it's just easier to reach this drop down menu and just modulate anything. So again, this is just a big overall view of all your modulation. This is the Modulation Matrix. So the global tab has some options that we didn't previously look at yet. You have a bunch of different preferences here. You can pick, the default overview. You can have the piano turned off and hidden. You have a helps window, which now when I hover my mouse over things, I actually get this nice little help box. I turned it off so it didn't block our tutorial, but if ever you're lost, turn that on. And a bunch of other really cool things. Mod wheel to wavetable position. So when you move this mod wheel, it'll change the wavetable position of your sound. Cool settings, very useful. Now up here, you actually have a quality mode for a Serum. So if you have the room, you could make it 4 times quality. I recommend it. You can fine tune the noise, which you couldn't do as specifically in the noise section. So if your noise is just slightly off, change it there. You can turn off pitch tracking for the individual oscillators so they don't actually track across your keyboard. This is really useful if, for example, you wanted one of the oscillators to be like a kick drum and you're making almost like a drum patch in here and you wanted the rest of your sound to track, you can do that there. Other important things, you have these chaos modulators. These are actually random modulators where if I were to drag this onto the volume or just right click mod source, grab chaos 1, it's just randomly modulating it. Every time I press it down, it's completely different. So that's really useful. Now, what we haven't looked at either is the unison options here. When I was talking about the unisons earlier, you actually have some cool options in here. So the range is how far the detune spreads them apart. 28 semitones like this is absurd, but you can do really small amounts like 1 or even none. You have a width, which is actually going to decide how far apart and wide those get. They don't have to be. So you can keep things pretty mono. You have a warp option, which will actually unison spread their warp value. The warp value being this knob here. It'll make sure that each unison is further apart in warp. Same with wavetable position, really cool. Now, what we didn't look at previously either is the stack, and the stack is going to stack on different octaves. So right here, 1 12 semitone octave stacked in the unison. 2 octaves. 3 octaves. A fifth an octave up. So you get some really cool harmonics out of that. And then you have the different modes, and the different modes are actually going to change where those unisons sit. So linear you see, as I increase the detune, they linearly get wider apart. If I change this to super, you can see the ones closer to the middle are it's almost exponential, not quite as exponential, which is very obviously tight, and then wider and wider and wider, growing exponentially, straightforward. Inverted, which is kind of like the inversion of exponential. And then you have random, where they're all going to sit somewhere randomly. As I move that, blah, they're all somewhere else in the detune and spectral width field. Crazy. So you have some options there, really useful. Now, the last of the things we haven't really looked at, you have a pitch bend range down here, which is going to allow you to actually pitch bend your sound in the MIDI clip. The value is this range, or alternatively, this pitch wheel will go that far. You have a mod wheel, which is just a mod wheel you would see on a keyboard normally, which you can use to modulate something. It's kind of like a macro, but what you have to do is say I want to change this wavetable position, mod source, mod wheel. If I picked a more obvious wavetable, it's another modulation source, really useful. Now down here you can make your sound monophonic, which means as I play more than one note, only one plays at a time, versus polyphonic, where I can play chords. The amount of notes I can play at one time is determined here, so I can play up to 8. If I set this down to 2, I can play 1, 2 at the same time. The second I introduce the third one took over the first one. Now, if you're in monophonic mode, you can add some portamento. Allows you to glide the sound there. And you also have a legato button there. We're almost done. Now, if you guys want, at any point, you can add little notes for your patch here. Super awesome patch. And you can add a name here. Kermode made this. You have a master volume here, a save so you can save your patch, a drop down menu to pick new patches, as well as a scrolling thing so you can scroll through patches. And then you have a menu here where you can do everything from initialize the preset, save the preset, all those things. I think that's it. I think we covered it. That was our Serum crash course. I just wanted to get you guys through it really quickly. I want you guys to learn as much as possible really quickly. I'm going to do a more in-depth course later. I'm going to do another course on the wavetables, and I'm going to do another course on, going to go into more detail. But I drank a lot of coffee today, and I just wanted to do this thing really quickly. I want to give you guys a really quick and handy resource, and I hope this was it. So thanks again, guys. I hope you guys got a lot out of this. This was the crash course in Serum, where I just quickly show you guys every parameter, how it works. I'm sure it was a lot to take in, so go back, pause, play, repeat, watch this thing, and I'll come back with more videos if you guys liked it out. I'm gonna go do something else now. Cool, thanks guys. I'm Kermode. Peace.